For as long as men have gone to sea, maritime nations have sought wealth and power beyond their borders. By the 18th century, Spain, France, Holland, Portugal and Britain had established vast colonial empires. And it was their grand sailing vessels of oak and canvas that became both vehicles for trade and the spearhead of security between colonies and home. In the era of sail, imperial jealousies were played out in dramatic confrontations at sea. The man of war, mounting row after row of deadly cannon, was the most devastating weapon of the age.
The British method of fighting in those days, whether you were a three-deck ship, a frigate or a line of battleship of 74 guns, was to close with the enemy as soon as possible and then bring all your guns to bear on his hull and pour your broadsides into his hull. You cannot actually sink very well a wooden ship. But what you can do by pounding the hull of the enemy is to destroy the morale of the people on board. And it's the destruction of their morale that will bring about their defeat.
In political terms, he who ruled the oceans ruled the world. And for almost 2 centuries, that nation was Britain. The first permanent navy, and arguably the first battleships, were the creation of the ambitious English king, Henry VIII. His fighting ships, like the Mary Rose, were revolutionary vessels designed solely for war. Until that time, battles at sea were fought between merchant ships armed with guns.
Well, I think it's fair to say that the Mary Rose is the first extant ship that was designed specifically for warfare on a large scale. So you can say she is an embryonic battleship, if you like. Well, whether the Mary Rose was built around guns or guns were built for the Mary Rose is actually a very, very difficult thing to analyze. Undoubtedly, the ship was designed for heavy guns. And without a doubt, this is the first series of ships that are designed specifically to take large guns on 3 decks.
Her armaments were a mixture of muzzle or front-loading cannon and early breech or rear-loading guns. A fairly unreliable weapon, but one that was to become the main armament of future battleships. Mary Rose and her sister ships were the foundation of a maritime dynasty that would influence world affairs for well over 3 centuries. Superweapons that became symbols of state for any self-respecting empire builder.
I think all the vessels within Henry VIII's infant navy, if you like, were symbols of both the king's power and also the might of Britain as a naval force.
In the following 200 years, confrontations between rival empires saw the fighting ship evolve into the magnificent ship of the line. HMS Victory, with her 3 gun decks, was a typical first-rate line of battleship. A vessel capable of keeping the sea in any season, in any part of the world. Launched in 1765, she carried 27 miles of rigging, set 4 acres of canvas, and took 6 years to build. a forest of more than 2,000 oak trees was felled for her construction. Victory was over twice the length and 7 times the tonnage of Mary Rose, and represented a dynasty of sailing ships that had become truly perfected as weapons in themselves.
The Victory, like all the other great sailing battleships of the period, like all battleships indeed, is a floating gun platform. Just look at that massive battery of guns that you see as you stand alongside her. 50 guns, all pointing towards you. 32-pounders, 24-pounders, 12-pounders, all designed to deliver a shattering blow, a blow that could destroy a building within a few minutes with the power of it.
She had a very heavy fire output. It's something like about half a ton of metal fired out on one broadside. She would have a very large crew, 820 to 850 men. And it must have been horrendous working in those conditions because the decks are relatively low. There is not much escape for smoke, not much escape from the damage that you receive either.
In the defence of empire, Victory's grand arsenal was to become Britain's front line in the most dramatic sea battle ever fought under sail. In 1803, Victory became the flagship of Admiral Horatio Nelson. It was a time when the British feared invasion of their country from across the English Channel by Napoleon's troops. The French leader boasted, "Let us be masters of the Straits for 6 hours, and we shall be masters of the world." On October 9, 1805, Nelson invited his captains to dine with him on board Victory. He told them of his dramatic plan to end, once and for all, the so-called Great Terror posed by the combined French and Spanish fleets. He argued that the traditional manner of approaching the enemy in single file and engaging them at close range was outdated. Instead, they would sail in 2 columns, heading for the enemy line to break it up and cause a general melee. The tactic was a gamble.
At Trafalgar, the 2 fleets were in contact from dawn on the 21st. They were approaching a collision at approximately 2 knots. So the men on both sides had ample time to breakfast and lunch and change their clothes and think about what was about to happen.
At the Battle of Trafalgar, Nelson's ships were by no means the largest or most heavily armed. But in the era of fighting sail, the means of waging war afloat was an art, not a science. It was commanders like Nelson who won battles, not ships.
The interesting thing about Nelson's tactics at Trafalgar is that he put himself into a position which normally you would have tried to avoid. And the reason he did that was because he realized that the French and Spanish fundamentally couldn't shoot straight.
Nelson's fleet of 27 men of war overcame the combined 33 ships of France and Spain in a matter of hours, clinching a decisive victory for Britain.
But I think it was the crushing nature of the victory. It showed that the Royal Navy even could defeat a superior fleet in terms of numbers, that in fact the Royal Navy could annihilate any equal. And it therefore sort of consecrated the image of the Royal Navy as the dominant fleet.
Excitement in Britain at the news of the victory was tempered by mourning. A shot to the chest added Nelson to the list of 5,000 who perished on both sides. Such was the human cost of a battle that secured Britain's sovereignty of the oceans for at least another 100 years. The next challenge to the Royal Navy's superiority came not in war, but from new technology. 19th century Britain was being transformed by the Industrial Revolution. Portsmouth, home to the Royal Naval Dockyards in the southeast, was set to become the largest industrial centre in the world. In its factories and shipyards, the sounds of the hammer and the adze were giving way to the throb of the steam engine, revolutionizing labor-intensive work, such as the cutting of timber and the manufacture of pulleys for rigging. By the 1830s, steam was powering merchant ships across the Atlantic, offering the promise of greater speed and mastery over unpredictable winds and currents. The British Navy explored the benefits of converting its warships to the new technology. But the Admiralty concluded steam would render its entire sailing fleet obsolete. When news reached London that the French Navy was already experimenting with steam, the British Admiralty had no alternative but to meet the challenge. In the 1830s, steam-driven paddle wheels were fitted to existing battleships. But the experiment proved a failure. Paddle wheels were found to be vulnerable to enemy fire and required too much deck space, reducing the quantity of a ship's cannon.
The paddle was fundamentally incompatible with the line of battleship. So the Admiralty produced specialist paddle vessels, paddle sloops and paddle frigates. And one of the important roles of these paddle steamers was to tow the ships of the line. By the 1840s, the battle fleet was a mix of ships of the line and each of them having a paddle steamer.
The perfect alternative to the paddle wheel first appeared in a visionary transatlantic liner of the mid-1840s, the Great Britain. Naval architects quickly recognized that the screw propeller was more efficient than the paddle wheel, and if fitted to battleships, would prove less vulnerable to enemy fire.
So it wasn't until the invention of the propeller, the underwater screw, and its application to warships that steam power really became a goer as far as naval forces were concerned.
The Great Britain featured another striking innovation, an iron hull. But the Royal Navy met suggestions that battleships should be built of iron with skepticism. With its time-honoured policy of preserving the established order, the Admiralty saw no reason to discard the wooden walls that had protected the Empire for centuries, unless, of course, it was forced to do so. In May 1858, disturbing intelligence crossed the English Channel. The brilliant French director of naval construction, Dupuy de Lome, had ordered a new radical type of battleship, which he promised could survive any confrontation. Plated with 4 inches of iron over her 11-inch teak hull, Gloire could lay claim to being the first iron battleship. And there were more on the drawing board. The British Parliament and press were alarmed at the development. The country was seized by panic
Les Anglais ont été mortifiés de voir que ils avaient manqué finalement le cuirassé. Même le mari de la reine Victoria s'est exprimé durement devant le Parlement, estimant que l'Angleterre devait quand même conserver la maîtrise de la mer par la technologie.
After months of tortured debate, British Admiralty decided again to meet the French challenge by building an even more radical vessel. A vessel designed to be the most deadly warship in existence. In 1860, Britain answered the Gloire with her own iron warship, HMS Warrior. Lord of the Admiralty Sir John Packington described her as the most courageous enterprise ever undertaken by the Royal Navy outside of war. She was 100 feet longer than any warship ever built, and the most heavily armed. Her 26 68-pounders were 5 times more powerful than the cannons carried by Nelson's Victory. She also mounted 10 breech loaders, which fired explosive shells, revolutionary weapons that had recently proved devastating to timber battleships in the Crimean War. The rear loading barrels were rifled, which greatly improved accuracy, spinning the projectile and giving it an unprecedented range of up to 2.5 miles. Warrior's gun deck and her massive steam engine were enclosed in an iron citadel 4 inches thick, making her impervious to any weapon of the day. And with a maximum speed of more than 14 knots, she could outrun any warship on the high seas.
She was so much stronger, so much faster, bigger, better in every way. Warrior would have dominated the Gloire.
The Gloire, if you like, stimulated the British into making this great change, but the change they responded with was quite beyond anything that the Gloire represented.
Gloire was a terrible error on the part of the French. We've been fighting a building race with the French on wooden steam warships, and the French had kept pace with our building. By changing into the new technology of iron and armour, French industry just couldn't cope, and they'd lost.
The age of the wooden battleship was all but over. Warrior and Gloire had rendered every warship on Earth obsolete. But soon they themselves would be outdated. A new race was beginning. A race between armour and firepower. When the American Civil War broke out in 1861, the ill-prepared Union and Confederate navies hurriedly began building ironclad warships. The Confederates' Virginia, a captured enemy frigate, was encased in railroad iron. Using its bow as a ram, it sank 2 Union frigates with ease, revealing the vulnerability of timber warships in the Age of Iron. The Union Navy countered with Monitor, a remarkable semi-submerged ironclad, designed by the Swede John Ericsson. In the first ever battle between iron ships, Monitor's new type of revolving turret gun proved faster firing than her opponent's fixed gun. More importantly, her crew only had to turn the gun, rather than the ship, to take aim.
The Monitor was the first warship in the world ever to have a turreted gun, and she was also obviously the first to use it in combat. And it was quite successful. What the turret meant was that a smaller, less expensive ship could deal with a larger ship whose guns couldn't be maneuvered. So it's a very different kind of technology and quite superior.
The turret gun was a powerful innovation. In a matter of decades, it would adorn every new battleship and spell an end to the fixed gun. In the 1870s, the battleship began to lose all vestiges of sail. The funnel, like the chimney stack on land, had become the outward symbol of progress. Navies also began adopting cutting-edge technologies for their battleships. Demands for greater protection saw steel take over from iron for armor plate. But even this breakthrough would soon be matched by an increase in firepower.
Once you open the Pandora's box of technological change, you can't shut it. It leapfrogs in a quite extraordinary way. One invention will lead to another. You invent a gun that will pierce armor. You then have to invent armor that will stop the gun piercing it. And so the development of battleship design was a never-ending leapfrog.
In the vast shipyards of France and Britain, a great battleship arms race was gaining momentum. But with every new generation of larger, deadlier battleships, the world became a more dangerous place. By the late 19th century, smaller navies around the globe also aspired to possess a fleet of the largest and most deadly machines ever conceived.
Culturally, Battleship becomes an icon of modernism, of technology, of progress. And for many nations that were not previously naval, the battleship of the 1890s and the 1900s becomes their introduction to the sea as a whole new way of thinking about their country. My country built this ship and put a name on it which tells us a great deal about how we see ourselves in the world, not at home, but in the world. A country with a battle fleet is more than a country, it's an empire.
In the early 1880s, a mere 20 years after the Civil War, the United States Navy was neglected and facing oblivion. President Grover Cleveland told his countrymen they had not a single vessel of war that could keep the seas against a first-class enemy.
In the 1880s, the United States is a very wealthy country. Large cities like New York, Boston, are essentially defenseless. And those in the Navy who are trying to make an argument that there should be a powerful U.S. Navy talk about European powers as possible enemies. There's still a very strong sentiment of anti-British attitude. Remember that we fought the British in 1812. Also, we worried about the fact that some of the South Americans were more powerful than we were. Brazil had bought some new battleships and we had nothing to match. There was a sense that the United States was a rich prize waiting to fall into someone's hands.
Despite the president's fears of invasion, the Congress was against building battleships, favoring the preservation of the nation's fiercely isolationist stance. A U.S. naval captain, Alfred Mahan, would dramatically change this mindset. In his classic book of 1890, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, Mahan traced the rise and fall of maritime powers. He demonstrated that the nation which controlled the seas controlled its own fate, and those lacking in naval mastery were doomed.
Specifically in his book, he argued that if one had a choice between developing sea power and land power, that a country was well advised to develop sea power because the return on investment was higher. And Mahan believed that any number of countries had this potential. It wasn't just a case of Great Britain, but also France, possibly Germany, but especially his own country, the United States.
Mahan made a dramatic suggestion. The United States should build an offensive rather than defensive navy, comprising an enormous fleet of battleships.
If the United States is to prevent Europeans from burning down American cities, which was the fear that we had at that time, it has to be able to put its fleet where they are. We defend the United States elsewhere, not in the United States.
Mahan's forceful ideas helped persuade Congress to build an ocean-going fleet. In less than 2 decades, the United States would boast the second largest navy in the world, comprising 17 battleships and 24 cruisers. Ships like the 6,000-ton cruiser USS Olympia, commissioned in 1893, were a coming of age for the US Navy, and for the country's stature as an industrialized nation. By government decree, every aspect of the ships, from their rivets to their armor and heavy turreted guns, were to be manufactured at home, pushing the nation's industrial capabilities to new limits. The decision to build an ocean-going battle fleet marked a radical shift in how the United States saw its position in the world, and how it was prepared to act. In late 1897, Washington received reports of a rebellion in the Spanish colony of Cuba over demands for independence. In December, the president dispatched the battleship Maine on a so-called friendly visit to Havana. Its mission, to ensure the well-being of US citizens living there and assert the nation's emergence as a naval force. Two months later, the Maine was destroyed in Havana harbor by 2 massive explosions. "252 men were killed in the disaster. For the first time, the tragic consequences of the loss of a battleship were captured on the new medium of the motion picture. For the American public, potent images of their nation's first blooding in the dangerous game of gunboat diplomacy. The reason for the catastrophe was later traced to an explosion in the battleship's internal magazines. But at the time, the US Navy concluded a Spanish mine most likely sank the ship. American popular opinion turned strongly in favor of retribution against Spain. In a matter of months, America would go to war by sea for the first time in its history. In late April 1898, Secretary for the Navy Theodore Roosevelt dispatched US warships to Cuba and other parts of the Spanish Empire. Commodore George Dewey commanded the Asiatic Squadron. Aboard his flagship Olympia, he set sail for the Spanish colony of the Philippines. At dawn on the 1st of May, Dewey's crew sighted a small squadron of Spanish gunboats anchored in Manila Bay. less than 6 hours, the Spanish ships were annihilated. News of the United States Navy's first victory at sea was greeted with national approval and thrust future President Theodore Roosevelt into the national spotlight. Over the next 3 months, the US Navy backed up the nation's troops as they captured the Spanish colonies of the Philippines, Guam, and islands of the Caribbean. With its modest fleet of battleships and cruisers, America entered a select club of empire builders and emerged as a new world power. The arrival of the US Navy on the world's oceans would, in time, cause concern for Britain. But as the century turned, the small island nation seemed impervious to any hostile power. Her wealth and independence came from the largest empire in history. 1/4 of the world's land and people were ruled by Queen Victoria and jealously guarded by her all-powerful fleet. But for most of the previous century, Europe had been a boiling cauldron of militarism. Border after border was drawn and redrawn in blood. As Europe's old nations crumbled, new ambitious empire builders emerged. And to consolidate their colonial ambitions, kings and emperors looked to the battleship. As the navies of Europe expanded, Britain guaranteed funding to the Royal Navy to maintain a battle fleet greater than the next 2 most powerful navies combined. Whether the country could sustain the enormous costs involved, however, was in serious doubt. By 1900, British industry and the economy was suffering a downturn. To make matters worse, a new industrial nation was emerging. A nation that dreamt of building battleships to challenge Britain's control of the seas. That burgeoning powerhouse of industry was the new United German Republic, ruled by Kaiser Wilhelm II.
It was only natural for a nation like Germany to wish to be a global power. She was a rising industrial state. There was nothing which said that Britain had a natural right to be the unrivaled world power. If you wanted to expand economically and strategically, then you had to go to sea.
4 decades earlier, in January 1859, a 101-gun salute heralded Wilhelm's birth. The news was greeted with enthusiasm in Britain, especially by Queen Victoria. Wilhelm was the Queen's first grandchild, born to her daughter Princess Victoria and future German Emperor Prince Frederick. From an early age, Wilhelm's obsession was with the sea and ships. As a boy, he holidayed with his English cousins and visited the giant shipbuilding and naval center at Portsmouth.
Wilhelm's visits to the United Kingdom always placed before him the primacy of the Royal Navy in British society, politics, and economy, the importance of the fleet when it came to Britain's premier role in the world at the time. This was drilled into the Kaiser from first-hand experience, from his earliest personal experiences as a child.
On the one hand, Queen Victoria was his grandmother, and in many ways, he seems to have loved her. And he was always very proud of wearing the uniform of a British admiral of the fleet. And he admired the British and their achievements in building up the greatest navy of the world at that time. On the other hand, he also thought that it would be necessary for Germany to follow the British example, to build ships,
to conquer the world.
The great Prussian tradition that Germany had inherited, however, was not seamanship, but soldiery. With the most powerful army in the world, the German parliament, the Reichstag, saw no purpose in building a battle fleet. But a maverick naval captain serving in the High Command, Alfred Tirpitz, shared the Kaiser's dream.
What brings Tirpitz to the Kaiser's attention is a memo that Tirpitz writes. It suggests something that has since become called the risk theory. In essence, it's this, that the Germans can indeed provide a major threat to the British Grand Fleet, the British Royal Navy. How is this possible? Short of massive numbers, short of prohibitive investment. Well, it's possible in this way. You can provide the Royal Navy with a major threat in its own backyard. And furthermore, you don't have to equal them in numbers or firepower. What you need to do is provide a sufficient risk so that if the British did engage you, the price would be so enormous for them to pay, both in preparation and in losses in battle, that they would be reluctant to take that step of direct engagement in a decisive battle, because it might cost them their sea supremacy. And of course, Tirpitz himself provides the Kaiser with the rationale and the selling power to say we should build a fleet, we can build a fleet, we can make the British think twice before checking our economic progress or our military progress.
The Kaiser was so taken by the daring strategy, he promoted Tirpitz to Secretary for Naval Affairs. With the obstacle of a conservative German parliament to overcome, Tirpitz went direct to the German people for support. A select group of teachers and university professors traveled the country to lecture about Germany's new frontier, the sea. In the Kaiser's words, millions of stubborn and bad-tempered Germans suddenly awoke to the benefits of a powerful battle fleet.
It's difficult sometimes to persuade a farmer in the middle of Bavaria that a battleship really means something to his future or his present. And the Navy succeeded admirably in doing just that.
Finally, public pressure helped persuade the members of the Reichstag to fund Tirpitz's massive battleship program. By 1907, Germany would surpass the United States as the second largest navy in the world.
There are discussions among historians whether the Germans really aimed at a hot war ending in a great battle like that described by Mahan, or whether the Germans only wanted to blackmail the British by putting a dagger at their throat, thus enforcing them to give the Germans, as they regarded it, their equal share of world power.
The sheer ham-fistedness of the German approach. They are involving themselves in blackmail. They're creating themselves enemies. There's a very splendid German historian who has said, look, this behavior was ham-fisted, it was clumsy, but it's a way that an aspiring power that's going up to being the most powerful power in Europe has always behaved.
Germany's naval challenge was met with foreboding in Britain. The government was forced to increase the naval budget yet again to keep ahead in battleship numbers. But for the Royal Navy, there was more at stake than sheer numbers could remedy. Inspired leadership was needed to match the brilliance of Admiral Tirpitz. That leadership was to be found in Admiral Jackie Fisher.
An extraordinary man, strange man, a genius, I think a little bit mad, like most geniuses are, but a man willing to come up with radical solutions for radical times.
When Fisher came to the Admiralty as First Sea Lord in 1904, he vowed to meet the German challenge. In a raft of sweeping and often controversial reforms, he ordered the scrapping of 100 outmoded warships and the return to home waters for scores of vessels on service around the globe. But his most important move was to establish a think tank of naval experts to assess the future of the battleship. Rapid advances in new weapons of war, the submarine, torpedo and mine, led some experts to argue the battleship's days were numbered. Fisher believed that fast armored cruisers would be the key to success in future wars. His so-called battle cruiser, while similar to the battleship in firepower, would need to sacrifice precious armor to gain speed, making it more vulnerable to torpedoes and mines. But a battle soon to be played out in the Far East would help settle any question of the battleship's future. In the second half of the 19th century, feudal Japan emerged from 200 years of self-imposed isolation. To defend her interests from foreign aggressors, samurai warriors traded their clans for armies and their swords for ships of war. By the turn of the century, the Imperial Japanese Navy boasted a fleet of 6 British-built battleships. Flagship of the fleet, the Mikasa, was typical of battleship design at the time. She was armed with 4 massive 12-inch turreted guns and a huge battery of smaller ordnance. Under the command of Admiral Hayakiro Togo, the Japanese fleet was a highly trained, tightly knit unit prepared for battle. When Japan became embroiled in a bloody war with Russia, she would prove herself a naval colossus in the making. In September 1904, the Russian Baltic fleet of 45 warships set out on a marathon voyage almost halfway round the world. Its purpose, retaliation for the Japanese destruction of its Pacific fleet in the Manchurian harbor of Port Arthur. Under the command of Admiral Zinovy Rozhestvensky, 5 new French-built battleships and 7 slow, barely seaworthy relics spearheaded the Russian fleet. After 8 long months at sea, the exhausted Russian fleet sailed into the Straits of Tsushima, right into the path of the Japanese battle fleet.
So when they finally reached the Straits of Tsushima, you had basically 2 very different fleets. A hardened, battle-trained Japanese fleet that knew exactly what it needed to do to win the battle, and a Russian fleet that was disorganized, full of ships that really were worthless, but that managed to tie down the ships that could have given a good account of themselves to a very slow speed. And when you get to the Battle of Tsushima, what you see is the Japanese were able throughout the battle to use their superior speed and superior gunnery to knock out the leading Russian ships, one after the other. If you look at it, it's like dominoes.
Japan's success against the Russian fleet was met with high praise in London. Indeed, Admiral Togo was hailed as the new Nelson for outmaneuvering a fleet of superior numbers. But to Britain's first Sea Lord, Jackie Fisher, the Battle of Tsushima confirmed that the current generation of battleships was far from adequate for modern wars.
The battle was fought at ranges that were relatively long for the time, 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 yards. That was long range for that time. The reports he was getting back from his attachés with the Japanese fleet were that 10-inch guns, 8-inch guns, 6-inch guns, these guns, they don't matter. You don't even notice them in a big battle. But what was really important were the 12-inch guns. The 12-inch gun fired on a flatter trajectory, it hit harder, and it was just a better weapon from everybody's perspective than a 6-inch gun.
In early October 1905, Fisher oversaw the construction of the most groundbreaking warship since HMS Warrior. At 15,000 tons and 527 feet in length, she was designed to be the culmination of the latest advances in metallurgy, propulsion, and armaments. Speed was armor, Fisher declared. She would be the first battleship to be fitted with the newly developed turbine engines, giving her an impressive speed of 21 knots. After only 4 months of construction, the massive hull was ready to launch. On a dull, wintry day in February 1906, tens of thousands gathered at Portsmouth's naval dockyards. With a bottle of Australian wine, King Edward christened her HMS Dreadnought. Over the next 8 months, 3,000 men converted the empty hull into a floating fortress. It was only then that Dreadnought's superior firepower became apparent. She would carry 10 12-inch guns, making her 2.5 times more deadly than her predecessors. In Fisher's mind, this all-big-gun battleship would be the supreme embodiment of firepower. With this one remarkable ship, Britain had yet again eclipsed all her rivals. But in doing so, she rendered every battleship on the high seas obsolete overnight, including her own. Almost immediately, Dreadnought sparked a new battleship-led arms race. A dangerous game of one-upmanship that would drive the world toward an unimaginable catastrophe, culminating in the largest naval confrontation the world had seen. By the 19th century, Britain possessed the largest and most powerful navy in history. A force that dominated the world's oceans. Over the next 100 years, the Industrial Revolution transformed her battle fleet from timber, canvas, and cannon into armor, speed, and firepower. The battleship had evolved into the most complex and expensive machine in existence. A weapon that drew a line between nations and empires.
Because the battleship was the ultimate weapon of war, this was the measure of your nationhood, if you like. This was the measure of your ability to stand high among the nations of the world and say, this is what we want, and this is what we will have, and we have the means to do it.
In 1906, Britain upset the global balance of power when she launched the deadliest battleship yet conceived, HMS Dreadnought. This first all-big-gun battleship triggered an epidemic of dreadnought fever that soon spread to the great navies of the world. Britain was now caught in a new arms race of her own making. A dramatic game of one-upmanship that would help push the world towards a global catastrophe and the largest naval confrontation in history. In the early years of the 20th century, Britain appeared relaxed and self-assured. The new monarch, King Edward, had inherited from his mother, Queen Victoria, an empire encompassing a quarter of the world. An empire that stood serene and unchallengeable, due largely to Britain's all-powerful fleet of battleships. The greatest threat to the British Empire came from the emerging industrial powerhouse of Germany, ruled by Kaiser Wilhelm II. In less than a decade, the Kaiser assembled the second largest battle fleet in the world and prepared his nation to challenge Britain's long-held dominance of the seas.
And of course, in order to justify a powerful fleet in Germany, the supporters of the German fleet tend to sort of emphasize the possibility of conflict with Britain. And indeed, to justify naval expenditures in Britain, you get an emphasis on the possibility of conflict with Germany. And that's one of the great problems with naval races, is that they create perceptions of hostility.
In late 1906, the cream of British society flocked to the naval dockyards at Portsmouth. They came to see for themselves their nation's revolutionary answer to the German naval challenge.
Quite suddenly, in 1906, the British complete a new battleship called HMS Dreadnought. And this ship is completely different from everything else. She has a new kind of engine, steam turbines, which up to then has been in a few liners and mostly in small naval vessels. Her armament is a single type of gun. There are 10 of them, 10 12-inch guns. She has the firepower of 2.5 battleships. So she can probably destroy any other battleship in the world. So it's as though the barometer, if you like, of naval power has been completely reset.
With the world's first all-big gun battleship, Britain hoped to put an end to its naval arms race with Germany. But it was an extraordinary gamble. In this one remarkable ship, Britain had rendered all battleships outmoded and inferior, including its own.
By rendering their older fleets not obsolete, but certainly less efficient, they gave other countries the opportunity, the temptation to catch up. And of course, in the very difficult international tension of that time, that is exactly what happened.
Kaiser Wilhelm's response to Dreadnought was indignation.
Well, the building of the Dreadnought really stunned the Germans, because this was the first ship which was built very, very secretly. The Germans knew that they either had to follow or that they had lost the race before it had really begun.
The political head of the Kaiser's navy, Admiral Tirpitz, saw Dreadnought not so much as a threat, but a development that could be to Germany's advantage. Tirpitz convinced the Kaiser and the German parliament that the battleship race could begin again, on almost equal terms. And besides political will, there was no reason for Germany not to overtake Britain in the contest. The Kaiser took up the challenge and began rebuilding his fleet with all big gun dreadnoughts.
There were great launching ceremonies taking place every year when a new battleship with a famous name was launched. Generally, the emperor came and gave a great speech often to Tirpitz's disfavor, because Tirpitz thought that it would be much better to keep one's mouth shut and not to tell the British what the Germans were going to do.
In early 1908, British Admiralty received disturbing intelligence concerning Germany's shipbuilding program. Its largest industrial company, Krupp, had recently built a new plant to make battleship armaments. Now it was secretly buying large quantities of nickel, a metal essential for hardening steel and integral to the manufacture of guns and armor. Indeed, Krupp was building massive gun barrels for Germany's dreadnoughts, well in advance of government orders, and in enormous numbers. Britain's First Sea Lord, Admiral Jackie Fisher, warned his government Germany might be building more dreadnoughts than the Kaiser admitted to. But the Liberal government was hostile to Fisher's demand for increased funding to meet the challenge. Prime Minister Asquith had come to power promising to cut the naval budget in favour of social welfare. But Fisher's position strengthened when Germany's closest allies, Austria and Italy, joined the dreadnought race. Out of mistrust for each other, Italy and Austria announced they were each building 4 floating fortresses of their own. With every dreadnought launched, Britain's naval superiority came under greater threat, and Europe edged closer and closer to war. By 1909, the mood in Britain verged on panic.
The rivalry with Germany created a situation where it was quite easy for politicians and publicists who wanted to sell newspapers to become paranoid.
Public pressure ultimately forced the Asquith government to bow to Fisher's demands for an all-out assault on the German challenge.
Fisher's objective is to break the back of the German challenge with an overwhelming response. Having raised the stakes with Dreadnought, his next objective was to break their challenge by going further. Not so much in quality this time as in quantity. And he persuaded the government through fair means and foul, mostly foul, to build 8 battleships in 1 year, something the Germans simply could not think about.
By doubling its annual shipbuilding program, the Royal Navy demonstrated to the world its resolve to outbuild any rival, whatever the cost. But ultimately, the British government felt it had been deceived. Germany was not secretly building more battleships than it publicly declared. Critics of Admiral Fisher claimed he had orchestrated the naval scare for his own ends and won the Royal Navy a shallow, conceited victory.
In fact, Fisher, in his secret writings, makes it clear he was quite confident that Britain had enough superiority. But in order to maintain the shipbuilding industry, in order to provide enough orders to keep this basic foundation of Britain's naval strength healthy, he connived at these rather unnecessary scares.
By 1911, the naval scare had evaporated. At the unveiling of a memorial for Queen Victoria, Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany walked together with the new British King, George V. Both were Victoria's grandsons, and the event marked a thawing in the relationship between the rival empires. Months later, a young, dynamic politician, Winston Churchill, became Britain's First Lord of the Admiralty. In controversial style, he quickly placed his stamp on Britain's most important bulwark, the battleship. Churchill's most significant achievement was to encourage the design and building of the Queen Elizabeth class of super dreadnoughts, the most powerful battleships the world had seen. Their 8 15-inch guns would be the dominant naval weapons of the era, capable of firing 2,000-pound shells more than 13 miles. Churchill gambled heavily with the Queen Elizabeth-class vessels. They were the world's first oil-powered battleships. Britain had no oil of her own, so she bought a major shareholding in the Shah of Persia's oil fields to guarantee supplies in the event of war. The days of the coal-fired battleship were numbered. Coal was dirty and time-consuming to take aboard. It also forewarned an enemy with a telltale smoke cloud that could be seen beyond the horizon. But by 1914, little could conceal the potential for war in Europe. The German military machine, led by Kaiser Wilhelm II, now seemed ready to carry its nation to war. As early as 1907, the Kaiser revealed his anticipation for war when he ordered the widening of the Kiel Canal to accommodate Germany's new fleet of dreadnoughts.
The decision to widen the canal to carry dreadnoughts was critical to the ability of the Germans to function as a first-class navy. If they were going to fight the British and they found half their fleet was stuck in the Baltic and would have to come around the north of Denmark, they would be engaged as they came round the north of Denmark by the Royal Navy and destroyed. It was critical to their strategic position to widen that canal so that she could use the full range of her facilities for a modern dreadnought fleet. So it was in that sense a hostile act.
The canal reopened in June 1914. It was a festive occasion. For the celebrations, the German High Seas Fleet welcomed a courtesy squadron of 4 British dreadnoughts and 3 cruisers. In mid-afternoon on Sunday the 28th of June, an urgent telegram reached the Kaiser's ship Hohenzollern. It was chilling news. The Kaiser's close friend Archduke Francis Ferdinand of Austria had been assassinated, along with his wife, in the Bosnian capital of Sarajevo. The festivities at Kiel ended abruptly. The ships of the Royal Navy sailed from German waters to take up their stations in the event of war.
There was no hate against Germany, and within the German Naval Officer Corps there was no hate against the British. And when the British ships left the harbor of Kiel, they made a single friends today, friends in future, friends forever.
A single gunshot in the Balkans had sparked the First World War. And when German boots trampled neutral Belgium, British troops were mobilized in pursuit. But if the land was to be where the dying took place, both Britain and Germany knew it was the sea where the war could be won or lost, in a single decisive battle. On the eve of hostilities, British Admiralty made a far-sighted decision to move its main naval base to Scapa Flow, off the northern coast of Scotland. In this isolated, windswept harbour, the Royal Navy assembled the most powerful battle fleet in history. 33 dreadnought battleships would spearhead its imposingly named Grand Fleet. 4 fast battle cruisers would act as scouts in advance of the battle fleet. This new class of capital ship was identical to battleships in firepower, but gained extra speed at the expense of armor protection. A designer vessel yet to be tested in war at sea. Scores of support vessels, submarines, torpedo craft, destroyers and cruisers would scout for and attack enemy ships, as well as screen their own capital ships in battle. With 177 large warships on call, Britain possessed a formidable superiority over Germany of 2 to 1.
When war starts in 1914, no one really knows what a big naval battle will be like. No one has ever concentrated the number of modern battleships the British have in one place. No one knows how well they can be controlled. No one knows how well they can hit at the ranges that they claim to fight at. So every naval officer in the world is waiting to see what a big battle will be like.
Winston Churchill's ultimate aim was to bring the German high seas fleet to battle and destroy it with his massive fleet of battleships and battlecruisers. But instead of enticing his enemy to sea with a close blockade of their coast, Churchill confounded Germany by ordering a distant blockade.
The British immediately do what Tirpitz does not expect. He expects them to follow Royal Naval tradition and try some sort of Copenhagening maneuver, which means they will immediately move on German naval bases, confront the German fleet, and try to destroy it prematurely before it could get itself prepared. They don't adopt that at all, right? They pull away from the coast and set up a standoff blockade. Which means the next move is the German move. The Germans don't know what to do.
Alfred Tirpitz argued for an all-out sea battle with Britain, even though the Kaiser had brought on the war too early and his fleet was far from optimum strength.
He was not at all prepared for war, and he knew it. This is no illusion as far as he was concerned. Would he share that with the Reichstag? Certainly not. Would he share that with many of his lesser commanders? Certainly not.
Germany's first blooding in the war at sea was to have an enormous impact on the Kaiser. As thousands of British troops set out across the English Channel to France, British Admiralty ordered a daring diversionary mission to ensure their safe passage. British light naval forces were dispatched to intercept enemy patrols near the German coast at Heligoland Bight. With their battleships still at anchor, a flotilla of German cruisers and destroyers fell unsupported into the British trap. Despite dreadful odds, their crews took the fight to the enemy. After 4 hours of chaotic action, a backup squadron of Britain's powerful battle cruisers moved in. Three German light cruisers and a destroyer, along with 1,000 men, were lost in the encounter. For Germany, the effect on morale far outweighed the losses in ships and men. The Kaiser issued orders limiting the power of his commanders and demanding the high seas fleet not to leave port again without his approval.
From a naval point of view, this was disastrous because the Navy had been built to fight Britain and to beat Britain. This was against their code of honor, and as well, it also helped to destroy the confidence of the people in the Navy.
With the Kaiser as its supreme commander, the German high seas fleet appeared in serious trouble from the start. The Royal Navy, on the other hand, entered the war with confidence in its leadership. Commander of the High Seas Fleet, Sir John Jellicoe, was arguably Britain's most respected sea admiral. The commander of the battle cruiser squadron, the flamboyant Vice Admiral David Beatty, immediately became a national hero for his victory at Heligoland Bight. To Winston Churchill, Britain's magnificent dreadnoughts and their crews were the culminating manifestation of naval force in the history of the world. But Germany had a wild card that no British admiral had ever had to contend with: the U-boat. In the first months of the war, U-boats sank 5 British cruisers and 1 pre-dreadnought battleship. The early successes of the undersea raider sent a clear message to Britain. The combination of the U-boat and the torpedo could wreak havoc on her battle fleet. In a letter to Churchill, Jellicoe argued for extreme caution. It would be suicide for Britain, he said, to lose her advantage over Germany in dreadnought numbers. Instead of the early sea battle everyone expected, the world's 2 most powerful battle fleets glared at each other across the brooding waters of the North Sea and wondered if their Trafalgar would ever come. With his battleships grounded at Wilhelmshaven, the commander of the German fleet, Admiral von Ingenohl, devised a strategy to revive the morale of his crews and, more importantly, seriously dent Britain's naval superiority.
The German problem was that their fleet was just not strong enough to take on the British Grand Fleet and its battlecruiser supporting fleet with any chance of success. Therefore, it had to come up with rather unsatisfactory alternatives. And the least unsatisfactory alternative was to try to draw out a portion of that Grand Fleet, probably the battlecruiser fleet, which was operating increasingly autonomously out of its base in Rosyth, into a situation where it could trap the battlecruiser fleet and with its full strength sink it. This would be quite a shock for the British in morale terms, and it would also, particularly if it could be repeated, if the exercise could be repeated again, perhaps grind the British battle fleet down to a point where a full-scale battle was on the cards. And so the Germans begin their policy of sort of tweaking the lion's tail.
With the Kaiser's approval, Admiral von Ingenohl laid a trap for Beatty's battlecruiser squadron. The bait, the towns and people of the Yorkshire coast. Audacious lightning strikes by Germany's battlecruisers brought the war to British soil for the first time. The British press condemned the targeting of innocent civilians. It was the first indication that the fledgling German Navy had little regard for tradition and moral conduct in war. On their first 2 sorties, the coastal raiders achieved little, slipping away before the British warships arrived at the scene. But on January the 23rd, 1915, Admiral Hipper's battlecruiser squadron set out on another raid. Their target, Britain's East Coast fishing fleet, which Germany believed was laying mines and gathering information for the Admiralty. But the Royal Navy had no need for fishing trawlers for their intelligence. Unknown to Germany, Britain had in its possession a captured codebook and a network of radio direction-finding posts along the coast.
What they don't know is the British have broken their codes, so instead of the raids being real surprises that may attract sudden reactions by some small number of British ships, the British know when the fleet comes out.
Vice Admiral Beatty's battlecruisers were ordered to sea to intercept the German raiders and bring them to battle. But what British intelligence failed to pick up was that Hipper would be supported by the entire German high seas fleet. The following day, Beatty intercepted Hipper's squadron at Dogger Bank. The Royal Navy had fallen into a German trap and faced certain defeat. Destroyers on both sides exchanged light fire. But rather than join in the battle, the German commander, Ingenohl, panicked. He ordered the high seas fleet to sail at full speed for home. The British battlecruisers gave chase. Accurate German counterfire forced Beatty's flagship Lion to retire. But in retreat, the Germans lost the fast armoured cruiser Blücher, along with more than 900 men. The Kaiser was furious over the debacle at Dogger Bank. He stood down his high seas commander for not engaging the British. Ironically, Admiral Ingenohl was merely following the Kaiser's order not to risk his beloved dreadnoughts. Until further notice, the high seas fleet would remain at anchor, imprisoned yet again by the Kaiser's paranoia. Over the coming months, Churchill grew increasingly frustrated by the failure to bring the German fleet to heel. In February 1915, he presented a dramatic plan to the War Council, one that could benefit from an offensive naval action. Weeks earlier, Turkey had strengthened Germany's cause by declaring war on the Allies as retribution for a century of bullying by Britain and Russia. Under the German Kaiser's guidance, Turkey prepared to attack its neighbor, Russia, in the Caucasus. The Kaiser predicted Russia would be unable to spare troops from the Eastern Front to repel the Turks. He was correct. Tsar Nicholas appealed to Britain for a diversion to be made against Turkey to relieve the threat of invasion. Churchill argued against a land campaign. Instead, he convinced the War Council that battleships could break through the Dardanelles Straits to the Turkish capital of Constantinople and put Turkey out of the war. The War Council immediately ordered the dreadnought Queen Elizabeth to sail directly to the Dardanelles. One of the most powerful battleships on Earth would spearhead a squadron of 8 British capital ships. If all went to plan, the naval operation would change the course of the war. But if the Queen Elizabeth came to grief, it would be a massive propaganda coup for Germany and her allies. Four French battleships steamed out of Algiers to join the contingent. For the first time since Trafalgar, the warships of France and Britain rendezvoused for battle. But on this occasion, they were allies. The The heavy guns opened up on the forts of the Dardanelles and Gallipoli Peninsula in an all-out effort to force the passage. But after pounding the Turkish fortifications for a month, the campaign proved a failure. Finally, it was abandoned after more than a third of the Allied ships were sunk or damaged by mines and Turkish counterfire. 4 weeks later, the squadron was back at action stations, paving the way for the fateful land offensive at Gallipoli. In one of the most controversial campaigns of the war, 300,000 Allied troops perished. Defeat in both campaigns was a major setback for Britain and resulted in Churchill's removal from the Admiralty. The appearance of long-range German U-boats in the Mediterranean brought new perils for Britain. After 2 warships were sunk, the Queen Elizabeth was recalled to home base. Still hoping for an all-out battle with Germany, Britain could not afford to sacrifice a single dreadnought to the marauding undersea raiders. Meanwhile, Germany's U-boat campaign had entered a new, more deadly phase. In retaliation for the British blockade of his country, Admiral Tirpitz convinced the Kaiser to declare the waters around the British Isles a war zone. Any ships met in this zone would be sunk without warning. But the sinking of the giant ocean liner Lusitania, with the loss of 1,200 innocent passengers, including 120 Americans, was a serious miscalculation. US President Woodrow Wilson pressured the Kaiser to cancel the U-boat campaign, with the threat that neutral America would enter the war against Germany. In frustration at the Kaiser's backdown, Admiral Tirpitz resigned. The architect of the German Navy had had enough.
After the sinking of the Lusitania, the Germans more or less had to give up the campaign they had started in February 1915. For the Navy, this was a great disappointment because it had nothing to do. It lay in the harbors of Wilhelmshaven and Kiel and began rusting. Everybody began losing confidence in the Navy. So when Admiral Scheer finally became Commander-in-Chief of the High Seas Fleet, he thought that it would be necessary to be more offensive in order to challenge at least part of the Grand Fleet and sink them and to show the flag in the North Sea.
On May the 31st, 1916, the German High Seas Fleet, commanded by Admiral Scheer, put to sea. "22 battleships, 5 battle cruisers, 11 cruisers, and 61 torpedo boats sailed into the North Sea, hoping to intercept a British squadron. For 2 days, the fleet scoured the area, gathering intelligence.
Scheer used both airships and U-boats, in effect to try to sweep the area before him in the North Sea to find out what was out there, to see if he could effectively sortie, have his presence reported, draw the Royal Navy out in a component, engage and retreat.
He was not trying to take on the British fleet in its full strength. All he was trying to do was to draw a portion of it into a situation where he could inflict disproportionate attrition upon it.
In the waters beyond Scapa Flow and Rosyth, German U-boats lay in ambush. If some of the British Grand Fleet could be enticed into the North Sea, the undersea raiders were ordered to sink as many dreadnoughts as possible. Unknown to Scheer, British Admiralty knew of the plan 2 weeks earlier. With the aid of the captured codebook, the Royal Navy had deciphered radio messages when the U-boats left for the patrol lines. On May 30th, another decoded message confirmed Scheer's plan to set sail the next morning. It was the moment Britain had been waiting for almost 2 years. Prepared for action, Jellicoe's battleship sailed from Scapa Flow 2 hours before Scheer's fleet had even left port. At the same time, the British battlecruiser fleet, commanded by Vice Admiral David Beatty, left the Firth of Forth. The British ships slipped past the German U-boats without incident. They hoped to intercept the German high seas fleet off the west coast of Danish Jutland, a name soon to become etched in naval history. At 1447, Beatty ordered HMS Engadine to send up one of her seaplanes to reconnoitre. Half an hour later, the German fleet was sighted. It was the first time aircraft had ever been used in a fleet action. But its efforts were in vain. A radio message confirming the sighting never reached Beatty's flagship. The German battle fleet now knew the Royal Navy was in the vicinity. But was it a squadron or the entire British Grand Fleet? The commander of the German battlecruisers, Rear Admiral Franz Hipper, sighted Beatty's battlecruisers on the horizon at 15:20. 28 minutes later, almost immediately, German gunnery proved devastatingly accurate against the British support craft. Then, in the space of half an hour, Beatty lost 2 of his 6 battlecruisers, Indefatigable and Queen Mary, with virtually all hands,
causing Admiral Beatty to make his famous comment, "There seems to be something wrong with our bloody ships today." There was. It wasn't so much the ships themselves, it was the way they're handling their ammunition. Ammunition doors are kept open, charges are taken out of their fireproof cases, piled up. These are charges which have at each end an igniter, which means that the whole thing is a disaster waiting to happen.
Despite his losses, Beatty was able to outwit his opponents, forcing the German fleet to pursue him, luring them into the clutches of Jellicoe's massive Grand Fleet.
So he's come up against every German admiral's worst nightmare, a one-on-one with the Grand Fleet.
At around 1800, 44 of the world's most powerful battleships went into action against each other. Countless support craft on both sides, cruisers, torpedo boats and destroyers, joined in the melee. Facing far superior numbers and outranged by British guns, the German fleet was struggling for its very existence. The British fleet, however, was dogged by poor communications and inaccurate intelligence. Finally, a brilliant turnaround maneuver by Scheer enabled his fleet to escape. Fearing mines and submarines, Jellicoe did not attempt pursuit. The battle seemed over. But half an hour later, Scheer made an extraordinary move.
He puts up another hoist, and they do a battle turn around again, directly back at the Grand Fleet, which a lot of historians have called the suicide run. And his ships open up with everything they've got. Of course, Jellicoe's immediate reaction is textbook. He turns 2 points away from the onslaught. And all of his ships simultaneously open up. And there's this amazing barrage of firepower. But also the Germans get quite a few shells in and do an amazing amount of damage. And then Scheer says, look, there are limits to even this. He orders his torpedo boats in close in. They laid down a spread of torpedoes. The last of the boats putting down a smoke screen. Scheer does another hoist for a 180-degree about turn. They go back about again, and they steam away from the Grand Fleet into the cordite smoke and under the cover of smoke and torpedoes. His ability to exert command and control on site, and his desire to keep Jellicoe off balance, and to keep Jellicoe reacting to him, may very well, in my estimation, have been the only thing that saved him.
Rather than pursue the German fleet through oncoming torpedoes, Jellicoe made the most controversial decision of his career. He turned away, allowing their escape.
What did actually happen was, of course, that Jellicoe obeyed his own orders. Jellicoe had written Grand Fleet battle orders and said, in the face of a torpedo attack by enemy destroyers, the fleet will turn away. Knowing that that was the prudent thing to do. That was the order you wrote if you were the only man who could lose the war in an afternoon.
The German ships limped back into port, testifying to the ferocity of the battle. Germany had lost only 2 capital ships, compared to Britain's 3, and was hailed as evidence of the superiority of German engineering and gunnery. Moreover, Berlin newspapers praised German efficiency, determination and heroism in battle, which had finally brought to an end the myth of Trafalgar.
From the Germans' point of view, it was an unimaginable victory. The Kaiser was overjoyed. Of course, Scheer immediately gets the Blue Max, the Polymerit, which is the highest military award that the German Empire can give. Only the most optimistic of them can possibly imagine, and Scheer does not, that this is a strategic victory. He's won tactically, but he knows he hasn't won strategically.
In the first instance, the German communique on the battle was wholly dishonest. They managed to forget the largest of their own casualties, exaggerated the British casualties, and claimed they'd won. But war and battle is not about casualties. It's about winning the battle and commanding the ground at the end. The Germans lost the battle. They lost the battle as soon as they realized they'd met the entire Grand Fleet. They ran away.
After Jutland, the victors, King George visits the fleet to honor England's heroes.
Overall, the British confirmed their superiority. Rather like Trafalgar, Jutland confirmed that the British ruled the seas and the Germans only came out at sufferance and had to go home as soon as possible.
And Britannia rules the waves.
Of the 8,500 men who perished in the Battle of Jutland, more than 6,000 were British sailors. 2,000 alone went down with the third battlecruiser lost, HMS Invincible. Strategic victory or not, it was a serious blow to a people who attached such importance to their navy.
Jutland was a terrible disappointment. The public were bitterly disappointed, and the Navy had to defend its position. And there are lots and lots of letters from naval officers saying, come on. You know, the first ones say we gave them a right tousing. And then when they realized what had happened, and the public realized what had happened, they were thrown back on the defensive and began writing letters saying, come on, it wasn't as bad as all that.
The government and the press immediately began searching for scapegoats. While Beatty and his battlecruisers had taken the brunt of the punishment, Jellicoe's battleships had returned to port without loss. Within the year, Beatty would replace Jellicoe as commander of the High Seas Fleet. Even King George V expressed dismay at Jellicoe's poor control of the fleet and timidity in battle.
Of course, Jellicoe takes an incredible barrage of abuse from his own people for not finishing Scheer when he had him, which I think is a vast underestimation of the German High Seas Fleet, of Reinhard Scheer, and also of the circumstances of the time. Jellicoe was a fine commander and a very, very able person. And to refight the battle on Monday morning, so to speak, is something that one should not do.
Apart from the strategic consequences of the Battle of Jutland, it really represented the flower of British and German industrial output. The battleships spoke much of what these countries were capable of producing, and they were manned, of course, by the cream of British and German manhood. So to that extent, it was a clash long anticipated, but one which was destined to end very badly for a large number of people.
Following the Battle of Jutland, Britain remained in control of the seas. But the clash of the great dreadnoughts had failed to bring a promised end to the conflict. Over the coming months, as the Great War engulfed the globe, naval strategists on both sides would dream of another encounter between their massive fleets. But for the thousands of young sailors who had already perished, without hope of rescue or understanding of the issues, both glory and defeat lay in a cold, anonymous grave. In the cold, brooding waters of the North Sea, more than 8,000 British and German sailors share a common grave. They met their fate in May 1916, at the height of the First World War. Off the east coast of Danish Jutland, the two largest battle fleets on Earth confronted each other for the first time. For little more than an hour, the fate of the world hung on ships, guns, and nerves of steel. Up against a British fleet twice its size, the German ships faced certain destruction. But as night fell, their commander, Admiral Scheer, made a brilliant escape. At battle's end, 14 British and 10 German warships lay at the bottom of the sea. Both sides claimed victory, but the Battle of Jutland had failed to bring a promised end to the war, and had shaken both countries' confidence in the battleship as the supreme arbiter of naval might. Following the Battle of Jutland, Britain remained in control of the sea lanes. But questions immediately arose as to why her all-powerful battleships had not delivered a decisive blow to the German high seas fleet.
In a sense, Jutland is an extremely good snapshot of the strengths and weaknesses of the battleship. Guns that can fire out to the horizon, being directed by the Mark I eyeball, with some optical assistance, but no radar. Ships being controlled by flag signal, as Nelson had done. So it's hardly surprising that it's very, very difficult for commanders to maintain control. It's relatively easy for fleets to get away. It is difficult to utilize this raw military strength of the battleship to bring about decisive results at the tactical and operational level. Very, very difficult, because the sensor and communications technology is not up to the job.
Germany's leaders, on the other hand, applauded their battle fleet for achieving a tactical victory against a fleet twice its size. But the Kaiser and his naval commander, Admiral Scheer, agreed the risks of another battle were too high. Moreover, further fleet action against the British offered little hope of forcing them to the peace table.
The scare of Jutland, the amazing tactical victory there, the German leadership realized the role that luck and amazing skill played in that. And that the British weren't going to let that happen a second time.
Everybody knew that even when the ships which had come back would be repaired and would be ready for war again, it would be unwise to risk such a battle again. And this was what Scheer recommended to the Emperor only 4 weeks after Jutland.
Following the Battle of Jutland, the German High Command abandoned the battleship for a weapon proving far more successful in the war at sea: the U-boat. By January 1917, more than 2,000 British merchant ships had been sunk, and Britain was facing the possibility of being starved into submission. Months later, Germany started an unrestricted U-boat campaign. All vessels would be sunk without warning, even ships of neutral nations. It was these indiscriminate attacks, especially on American merchant ships, which brought about a major turning point in the conflict. On April 4th, 1917, the United States government declared war on Germany. Within a month, the first American troops embarked for Europe to make an all-out assault on the Kaiser's armies. The major challenge was to ensure their safety across the U-boat-infested waters of the North Atlantic. The new allies, Britain and America, agreed to supply naval ships to protect convoys of troopers and merchant ships. For the first time in the war, the scale of sinkings by U-boats declined dramatically.
The main thing is we take American troops to Europe and we convoy them. Old American battleships, cruisers, destroyers are used for convoy escorts, and a very large army is moved into Europe. That army proves quite decisive.
Five US battleships were also seconded to the British Grand Fleet. The USS Texas arrived in British waters in early 1918. Armed with 10 14-inch guns, she was one of America's first super dreadnoughts. With a crew of over 1,000 men, Texas was a floating city, boasting one of the finest hospitals on the high seas.
We were only allowed 4 hours ashore at a time. We were always under 4-hour standing orders, because they always hoped or expected that the German fleet would come out. And we went out quite frequently. I mean, I'd say we were out maybe 2 or 3 times a month. They'd get some rumor that there was some activity out there in the North Sea, and we'd take off and go out there and try to run them down.
Throughout 1918, the Allied blockade of Germany tightened, starving the nation of food and munitions. But for those American seamen expecting enemy action, there was disappointment. The German Navy remained a virtual prisoner of fear, rarely leaving port and allowing Britain and her allies to control the seas. In the final year of the war, the only loss of a major warship was the Sven Istvan, belonging to Germany's closest ally, Austria. As the vessel slid into the Adriatic Sea, 89 sailors perished, including the captain. The destruction of a modern dreadnought by an inexpensive torpedo boat sent shockwaves through the world's major navies. But throughout 1918, the scale and horror of land battles on the Western Front eclipsed in importance naval matters for both sides. By mid-October, Germany was negotiating with American President Wilson for a way out of the war. Then in late October 1918, British naval intelligence intercepted a German message that electrified the Admiralty. With the war all but lost, German naval staff had defiantly hatched a dramatic plan for one last sortie by their high seas fleet.
There is mounting frustration among the ship commanders at Kiel and Wilhelmshaven when they feel that all the future holds for them is to sit in a fleet inactive, which will possibly be captured or even destroyed at the piers at war's end.
Rather than surrender their ships, the officers decided to challenge the British Grand Fleet in one final battle. The desperate plan was to be kept secret from the Kaiser, but rumors quickly spread amongst the ratings.
When the word gets out among the crews that the so-called death sortie is being contemplated, and indeed approval is given by the High Command to begin preparations. There are a series of mutinies.
In one of the largest mutinies in history, the German high seas fleet stood paralyzed at anchor, but this time on the order of the common sailor, not their supreme warlord.
At these times, the newspapers are full of reports that the German side wanted to have cease-firing, and the sailors and stokers, they knew this development.
Admiral Scheer did his utmost to convince the men to fight. An honourable battle by the fleet, he said, even if it is a fight to the death, will sow the seed of a new German fleet of the future. 5 times the order to put to sea was given, and 5 times it was ignored. The German sailors had resolved to bring the war to an end. On the 9th of November, the Kaiser was told that his navy could no longer be counted loyal. It was the final straw. The following morning, with his nation on the verge of revolution and under pressure from the American president, the Kaiser sought exile in Holland. 24 hours later, the war to end all wars came to an end. The 21st of November 1918 was the most poignant moment for the Royal Navy since Nelson's victory at Trafalgar. Along with 2 squadrons of American and French battleships, the entire British Grand Fleet set sail in full fighting order into the North Sea. Their mission? To intercept the German high seas fleet. From their bases at Kiel and Wilhelmshaven, 91 warships of the Kaiser's beloved navy set sail for the last time.
This was, of course, something which had a deep impact on the psychology of the Naval Officer Corps. Because for them, instead of the day of victory, this was a day of shame.
At 8 a.m., the German fleet appeared out of the haze.
The thing that I remember, standing on deck and seeing all these ships come in line. I don't know how many there was quite a few of them though, but I could see that they were in a pretty run-down condition. And I don't think they've been maintained. And it was a kind of a sad thing to see all these immense big ships come in there. But it was an overcast, dull day. And what shall we say is a funeral day. And it was a funeral for the German Navy.
Sandwiched between 2 columns of Allied warships, the pride of German engineering and seamanship was escorted back to British waters.
And the victory is rubbed in. It did demonstrate the fact that the Grand Fleet had been able to keep command of the seas of the world outside the North Sea. It had been incapable of destroying the High Sea Fleet, but it had been fully capable of neutralizing it, and this ceremony symbolizes that.
Over the coming months at Versailles, the victors decided on their punishment for Germany and her allies. The peace treaty stripped Germany of land and severely restricted the size of both its army and navy.
The Germans were, for instance, forbidden to have an air force. They were to have no more submarines. Their fleet was restricted to pre-modern, pre-dreadnoughts, which, in the case of war, were useless, as everybody knew at that time.
As talks continued at Versailles, the German high seas fleet lay imprisoned in Scapa Flow, awaiting its fate. But the German officers feared their ships would be handed over to Britain and her allies. They set into play a daring plan, unprecedented in history.
It was midsummer, 21st of July. I was 10 years old, and 300 children were invited down to visit the fleet. Both the British fleet and the German fleet were lying in Scapa Flow. And we went down with sail in the pathway between the ships so that we got a very good view of the ships. We had been warned by the teachers that we hadn't to make any noise or cheer. And on our way down, we got a message from another ship which said that the British fleet had gone out that morning for exercise and that they were not returning until they had got this amazing news, which of course was that the German fleet was sinking.
Just after midday, the German crews scuttled their ships.
They stood an end on the bows, they went over, they dived, they sank low, they rose in the water. I myself saw 12 capital ships go down. I'll never forget the sight of it.
"52 ships went to the bottom that day. German honour salvaged by the greatest act of self-destruction in maritime history. But to Admiral von Tirpitz, the architect of the fleet, the scuttling couldn't salvage Germany's dream of a global empire. "The German people do not understand the sea," he wrote. "In the hour of our destiny, we did not use our fleet. Whether our grandsons will be able to take up the task again lies hidden in the darkness of the future." After 4 long years, war weariness was slowly replaced by unbridled optimism and zest for life. For the British Royal Navy, now was the time to take stock and plan for the future. But with the German fleet lying at the bottom of Scapa Flow, the British Parliament told Admiralty that the Royal Navy was too large for peacetime. More than 100 outmoded warships, including the once revolutionary dreadnought, were sold for scrap. The United States, however, embarked on a different course. Now the world's leading industrial nation, she deliberately set out to displace Britain as the dominant naval power. By 1921, American yards were constructing 6 enormous battlecruisers and 12 of the largest and most powerful battleships ever designed. Once completed, they would outclass all existing capital ships and threaten the balance of global power. In the Far East, Japan watched America's naval build-up with unease. During the First World War, Japan had aligned itself with Britain and America against Germany. But after the war, Japan saw the United States as the main obstacle to her growing power in the Asia-Pacific region.
Japan is obviously the single most powerful naval nation in the West Pacific and East Asia. The other great Pacific power, of course, is the United States. It is not unnatural, therefore, that the two navies begin looking at each other, even though the interests of the two nations are not grossly antithetical. Nevertheless, the two naval establishments begin to see in a very hypothetical sense, yeah, that fellow over there may give us problems in the future.
For its origins and traditions, the Japanese Imperial Navy had looked to Britain. Her naval officers were sent to Britain for training, and British shipyards supplied Japan with the majority of her battleships. But now Japan was determined to stake its claim in Asia and secure it with its own homegrown battle fleet.
And we see the laying down of a series of Japanese capital ships, which at the time that they were launched were simply more powerful, more heavily armed than anything else afloat.
America's naval buildup was also viewed with suspicion in Britain.
After the First World War, the main enemy for war planning becomes America. There is a committee that looks into the future of the battleship in Britain, and all the scenario planning is done with America as the enemy. Reads a little strangely now.
The assumption was that trade caused wars, and there would be a big competition for world trade. The United States was the greatest economic power in the world. The British would obviously resist us, and so there might be some explosion. Except that those who would write these things never quite explained how this explosion would ever happen.
By the early 1920s, Britain was embroiled in a new and expensive arms race, one she could neither afford nor afford to lose. The magnificent HMS Hood, completed in 1920, reassured Britons the Royal Navy could rally to the challenge. With her 8 15-inch guns and an extraordinary maximum speed of 31 knots, Hood blended the firepower of a battleship with the speed of a battlecruiser. But Hood was designed in 1915, a year before the Battle of Jutland. America's new ships, however, were designed after Jutland and reflected the hard-won lessons of that battle.
Ships of greater firepower, of greater protection than any existing British warship. So the plans of the American Navy would lead to a battle fleet vastly superior to the British if the British didn't rebuild their battle fleet.
With America building superior ships, British Admiralty called for even larger, heavily armoured and faster vessels, mounting super guns of up to 18 inches. But the triumphant allies of the Great War appeared totally blind to their folly. Battleships were the most expensive weapons on Earth, yet in the entire 4 years of hostilities, they had confronted each other in only one battle, and for little more than a single hour. Now they were the focus of a new arms race, a contest that could bankrupt nations and spark a new global catastrophe. Suddenly, in 1921, American politicians had second thoughts. US Secretary of State Charles Evans Hughes called for a conference to be held in Washington and attended by the 5 major naval powers. Its primary focus, arms limitation of the battleship.
Here we see battleships as symbols, because if you're going to disarm or limit armaments, what better way to make that case than to get rid of battleships or not to build new ones?
And basically what happens at this conference is that the Americans say, look, none of us want a naval race, do we really? Let's agree to cut back our programs to a point where we and the British have parity and where the Japanese have 3/5 of the individual strength of Britain and America to protect their own sphere in the Pacific. The magic 5-5-3 ratio.
The Washington Conference was unprecedented, both in its aims and results. The major naval powers agreed to a dramatic reduction in the quantity, firepower, and size of their capital ships. The American Navy would destroy 4 existing dreadnoughts and 17 under construction. The Royal Navy would scrap 22 existing dreadnoughts and 4 partly built battle cruisers. But the most surprising outcome was Japan's agreement to limit its fleet to 60% the tonnage of both the US and British battle fleets, even though hardliners in the Imperial Navy believed the treaty an affront to Japan's ambitions.
ところが逆に言うと日本の場合はあの時はもう国家予算の40何%ですか、あれをずっと88艦艇を全部作ってたらもう国家がバンクラフトしそうな勢いだったために、あの時は完全に日本の場合シビリアンコードで聞きましてね、そしてワシントン条約をお受けした。
Even small navies were victims of the agreement. The flagship of the fledgling Australian Navy, the battle cruiser Australia, was considered a British ship. In April 1924, she was scuttled off Sydney Heads. But in the end, it was Britain which lost on the deal. With the stroke of a pen, she surrendered her long-standing supremacy of the seas. But by sharing the balance of power with America, she avoided an unrestricted arms race she could barely afford.
So therefore, Washington caps this arms race, an arms race which, if it hadn't been capped, could have had some quite serious effects. It's often said as a criticism of Washington that Washington didn't prevent Pearl Harbor, Washington didn't prevent World War II. Well, of course it didn't. But it perhaps prevented the great Anglo-American War of 1928.
The Washington Treaty was universally welcomed. Diplomacy had brought an end to the spiralling arms race and fostered a new sense of global security, at least for the 10-year term of the agreement. But in military circles, debate continued over the strategic value of battleships in modern war. In 1921, United States Army aviator General Billy Mitchell made the controversial suggestion that the battleship was obsolete. In future wars, he said, aircraft would prove the dominant weapon. He called for the United States to create an air force separate from the Navy and Army because they were too conservative and surface-oriented. To prove his point, he challenged the Navy to a showdown between the bomber and the battleship.
In some circles, he was viewed as brilliant and visionary. In other circles, he was viewed as an eccentric and a crackpot. He arranged bombing tests by land-based aircraft. And his idea was that fleets and armies were no longer relevant, that strategic bombing could accomplish all that one wanted to in the way of warfare.
In his most controversial demonstration, Mitchell set out to destroy an old German dreadnought, the Ostfriesland. After numerous unsuccessful bombing raids against the stationary target, Mitchell defied his commanders and ordered his pilots to pound the battleship until it succumbed.
Which proved that an old German battleship with no damage control, stopped in the water and with no anti-aircraft guns, could be sunk by bombers, to which the Navy could only say, big deal. It proved very little.
Billy Mitchell didn't get his independent air force, Instead, he was court-martialed 4 years later for insubordination. But Mitchell had given the world's navies a glimpse of a technology that would continue to evolve, while the battleships stagnated under the Washington Treaty. For the victors of the Great War, the 1920s delivered peace and stability. But for vanquished Germany, it meant humiliation and bankruptcy. The Treaty of Versailles had left the nation's political and economic life in disarray. By the end of the decade, the harsh war reparations and a worldwide economic crisis had plunged Germany into depression.
The German political and economical situation today is extremely difficult. This is the result not only of having lost the World War, but above all the outcome of the fact that Germany's former enemies are oppressing her above endurance.
When the German government complained it was too poor to pay its war debt, American banks agreed to generous loans. Funds it channeled into rebuilding German industry and national pride. But some of the loans were siphoned into a controversial series of warships. The Deutschland, Admiral Graf Spee and Admiral Scheer were the size of cruisers, but built in battleship fashion. And at 14,000 tons, well over the 10,000-ton limit dictated by the peace treaty. The British press sounded the alarm, calling them pocket battleships. Their stated purpose was to serve as convoy protection in the event of war. But even to a naive observer, the fitting of the latest diesel engines, capable of 26 knots and a stunning range of 20,000 miles, required an ulterior motive. Armed with 6 11-inch guns in 2 triple turrets, these vessels were designed to destroy merchant shipping anywhere on the high seas. Even British Admiralty admitted they could be destroyed only by a handful of its most powerful capital ships.
These big German cruisers were called armored cruisers by the Germans, or armored ships, but everyone else says it's a pocket battleship. It's like a little battleship because of the guns. Well, how do you deal with this thing? You can't deal with it with regular cruisers. They don't have the guns, or at least it doesn't seem that way. You got to build a bigger one.
For Germany's neighbours that had suffered in the Great War, the resurrection of its navy was viewed with deep suspicion. The French response was highly provocative. They would build 2 new battleships, even though they could barely afford to do so. The 27,000-ton Dunkirk and her sister ship Strasbourg were twice the tonnage and more than 4 knots faster than Germany's pocket battleships. Their 8 13-inch guns were spread across 2 turrets and offered superior firepower over their German rivals. In 1934, Italy further increased tensions by building 3 powerful battleships. Once completed, the Vittorio Veneto class ships would be capable of 30 knots and be heavily armed with 9 15-inch guns. But at over 41,000 tons, these massive battleships flew in the face of the Washington Treaty limit of 35,000 tons. A dangerous new arms race had begun.
The naval powers decided that they would build these big, expensive monsters because other people were building the big, expensive monsters, and the only thing you could be sure that really could kill the other person's big, expensive monster was a big, expensive monster of your own.
But of all the major naval powers, Japan was the wild card. In the early 1930s, her grievances with the West were plentiful and deep. The United States and Britain were deliberately blocking Japanese trade to their markets, and their colonies in Asia stood in the way of her ambitions for the region. But it was bitterness over further naval limitations forced upon Japan at London in 1930 that finally pushed her to breaking point.
It, in effect, brought down the Japanese government because the Japanese naval minister who was at London, who agreed to sign the treaty, was denounced by the Navy General Staff. The Japanese premier, who had agreed, who also put his imprimatur upon the treaty, was later assassinated at Tokyo, the Tokyo railway station, by a right-wing nationalist, largely because he was seen as somebody who had betrayed Japanese national security.
In 1931, Japan became the only Washington Treaty member to go to war. After annexing Manchuria, she prepared to assert her growing power over China and throughout the Far East.
Today, because of the lust and usurpation of power by her military chieftains, who are bent on...
When the League of Nations condemned her aggression, Japan walked out, vowing never to return.
Japan finds herself all alone.
In London in 1935, at another round of naval talks, Japan stunned the meeting. Head of the Imperial Navy, Admiral Yamamoto, proposed the complete abolition of the battleship, the only weapon that could threaten Japan. These ships, he said, are like elaborate religious scrolls, which old people hang up in their homes. They are purely a matter of faith, not reality. The battleship, he claimed, was as useful in modern warfare as a samurai's sword. But Yamamoto's proposal was dismissed out of hand, and Japan withdrew from the talks. The treaties that had kept the world from war were falling apart.
The Japanese quite deliberately destroy the Washington Treaty system to spurt ahead, to maximize their naval strength by the end of the 1930s, so that they can cash in that naval strength to carve out the Great East Asia co-prosperity sphere. One analyst has called this the race to Pearl Harbor.
Unknown to the world, Japan was already planning a new and extraordinary series of battleships. In 1937, at Nagasaki and Kure City, construction began on two vessels that would outrange and outgun any warship afloat.
The Japanese were completely committed to this policy of technological superiority. They knew they couldn't outbuild in numbers, so they had to outbuild in quality. And the result was the two biggest and most spectacular battleships in the history of navies, Yamato and Musashi.
Once completed, Yamato and Musashi would be almost twice the tonnage of the largest British and American battleships. They would be armed with 9 18-inch guns, the most powerful ever placed aboard a capital ship. They were deemed so sensitive, details of their construction were kept secret, even from the Japanese public.
大和と武蔵っていうものは戦争中は一切国民に知らされておりませんでした。それで新鋭戦艦の写真が出ましたんですけどもね、それは大和武蔵ではなくして利根の三連装砲の従順の利根の写真でありまして、これを巨大戦艦と、嘘の発表をしております。それほど国民にはベールに包まれていたわけですね。
In the late 1930s, there were some intelligence reports, interestingly, that came out of Italy, but seemingly authentic, that the Japanese were introducing some monster new type of battleship with larger guns than were allowed under the expiring international limitations on armament agreements. So this gave some stimulus to the United States to put more capability into its own warships.
With the fracturing of the Washington Treaty and a growing mistrust of Japan, the United States committed itself to a huge capital ship construction program. Between 1937 and 1941, American shipbuilders would lay down 10 fast battleships. The 35,000-ton North Carolina was the first commissioned. Nine 16-inch guns spread 3 apiece across 3 turrets would now be the standard armament for all American battleships. With its powerful new battle fleet now under construction, the United States sent Japan a clear message that it would outbuild her whatever the cost.
The Japanese, who believed that their naval security demanded unfettered naval construction, simply refused to come to grips with the fact that the Americans could ultimately outbuild them.
For Britain, the new naval race was unwelcome. Her shipbuilding and weapons factories had suffered severe cutbacks due to the Washington Treaty. When the agreement terminated, her crippled facilities were revived by an injection of political panic. By 1937, a formidable shipbuilding program was in place, with 2 of 5 King George V class battleships under construction. At 37,000 tons, they would be heavily armoured with belts 15-inch thick. But the rush to build them came at the cost of firepower. The vessels were fitted with 10 14-inch guns, the Admiralty unable to wait an extra year for the manufacture of 16-inch guns, favoured by Japan and the United States. But for Britain, time was the compelling factor. Everywhere she looked, she saw potential enemies. By the mid-1930s, Europe was a boiling cauldron of militarism. In Germany, Adolf Hitler led a new Nazi government. He turned his back on the League of Nations and prepared his people to fashion the future with blood and iron. Soon after he came to power, Hitler further strengthened his navy, regardless of Germany's obligations under the Treaty of Versailles.
Hitler's view basically is, I don't care about treaties, I don't care about limitations, I want the real thing. Hitler is also very much entranced by the romance, if you like, of battleships. They cost the earth, but boy, they're great symbols of national power. So he starts building battleships.
In the late 1930s, the new Reich Navy commissioned two formidable 32,000-ton capital ships, Gneisenau and Scharnhorst. They were armed with 9 11-inch guns, but their ingenious design allowed for later replacement with 15-inch guns. Then in early 1939, Hitler presided over the launch of the two most powerful German capital ships ever built, Bismarck and Tirpitz.
These ships were named after Bismarck and Tirpitz for political reasons, because they demonstrated German strength.
At more than 42,000 tons, Tirpitz and Bismarck would carry 8 15-inch guns and be the best protected warships yet designed. With its stunning new capital ships, Germany had re-emerged in less than 20 years as a major naval power. But Hitler had an even bolder vision for his navy. In 1938, he authorized the construction of a fleet of 8 super battleships, 5 battle cruisers, and 2 aircraft carriers.
In spring 1938, Hitler said to the Navy, well, in the long term, you must prepare for this war situation, and I want to build up a fleet who is able to fight next war against Great Britain.
Plan Z, as it was called, was to be completed by 1944, a year Hitler had earmarked for war. His most ambitious plan was for a battleship to end all battleships. A 144,000-ton nameless giant, more than twice the size of the Japanese Yamato and Musashi. Capable of 34 knots and carrying 8 20-inch guns, this demonically inspired ship, if built, would extinguish all competition and take the battleship into a frightening new realm. But Hitler's startling vision for his navy would only be partly realized. Events of his own making had intervened. In late August 1939, an old German battleship, Schleswig-Holstein, sailed into the Polish harbour of Danzig on a so-called friendly visit. It was to be a turning point in history. 6 days later, without warning, the battleship's guns opened up on Polish fortifications. These shots from an aged battleship signaled the start of the Second World War and the beginning of a naval conflict that would spread to all the world's oceans. For the phoenix-like German Navy and the men responsible for its resurrection, the darkness of the future had finally arrived. For more than 300 years, the battleship ruled the seas, a symbol of national strength and might. At the outbreak of World War II, it remained the centerpiece of all battle fleets, reaching its peak in size, speed, and firepower. But as the war spread to the world's oceans, the battleship's key role in naval strategy came under threat. Rapidly evolving technologies were waiting in the wings, ready for a dramatic confrontation, a battle for control of the seas. Dawn on the 1st of September 1939. An old German battleship opened up its 11-inch guns on fortifications in the Polish harbour of Danzig. These shots signalled the start of a conflict that would soon escalate into global war. Two days later, the day Britain declared war on Germany, Winston Churchill arrived at Admiralty House as Britain's new First Lord of the Admiralty. It was a bittersweet moment. He'd held the post during the First World War, but was forced to relinquish it following disastrous naval and land campaigns against Turkey. The navy Churchill now controlled was a very different force. Arms limitation treaties of the 1920s and 30s had seriously reduced the Royal Navy's fleet, which once numbered 70 battleships and battlecruisers. Now, with only 12 of these large capital ships in service and 5 under construction, the British Empire had never been so vulnerable.
On the 3rd of September, we were at sea. I had the pleasure of standing on the direction tower of Hood, making by semaphore to the fleet, commence hostilities against Germany.
Britain's only comfort was that Germany had scuttled the majority of its warships after the First World War. But throughout the 1930s, the new Reich Navy built an impressive series of warships, including 2 fast battleships, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. And at the shipbuilding centres of Hamburg and Wilhelmshaven, 2 of the most powerful battleships ever built, Bismarck and Tirpitz, were being fitted out. But they wouldn't be operational until 1941. Indeed, Hitler had promised his admirals that by the mid-1940s they would have the world's most formidable fleet. But this was 1939, and there was no prospect of challenging the Royal Navy to a full-scale sea battle.
Because of the problems the Treaty of Versailles had forced upon it, the German Navy was not a high-sea fleet in the way it had been. The Germans were forced, therefore, to engage in what was effectively a guerre de course, a war against trade.
From day one of the war, German submarines targeted merchant ships carrying war supplies to Britain. Six weeks later, a German U-boat struck right at the heart of the Royal Navy. U-47, commanded by Gunther Prien, made a daring assault on the key British naval base at Scapa Flow. The battleship Royal Oak was sunk, with the loss of more than 800 crew and officers. For Britain, it was a disaster. The Royal Navy had been humiliated. On their triumphant return to Germany, the U-boat's crew was feted as heroes. Their success enhanced Hitler's opinion of his navy. It also encouraged him to wage unrestricted war against British and French trade. In the South Atlantic, the powerful German raider Admiral Graf Spee was soon creating havoc with merchant shipping. Graf Spee quickly rose to the top of Britain's most wanted list. In mid-December 1939, the Graf Spee was intercepted off the east coast of South America by 3 British cruisers: Ajax, Exeter and Achilles.
And of course, all of a sudden, off went the alarm rattlers and the bugle sounded, and I was partly undressed, and I flew up several ladders onto the gun deck with my trousers in one hand and my sea boots in the other.
In the Battle of the River Plate, Graf Spee's powerful 11-inch guns soon found their mark, forcing Exeter to retire. But Ajax and Achilles closed in, scoring direct hits on the Graf Spee.
All in all, I think we fired over 100 salvos, which is quite a lot of work for the guns. They were so hot at the end of the action, in fact, that all the paint had peeled off them.
Limping into the harbor of Montevideo in Uruguay comes the German pocket battleship Graf Spee to bind the wounds received in combat. For the German sailors and the Graf Spee's commander, Captain Hans Langsdorff, the first naval battle of the present European war has ended in defeat.
Under international law, the German warship could only stay in the neutral port of Montevideo 72 hours. As Captain Langsdorff buried his dead and considered his next move, British intelligence was working feverishly behind the scenes.
Captain Langsdorff had been tricked by the British intelligence service working from the British embassy in Montevideo into making him believe that there was a very powerful British force outside the Rio Plata, waiting for him.
Finally, with the situation looking hopeless, the Graf Spee up-anchored and headed for the open sea, and what her captain believed was an overwhelming British battle force.
She got underway and slowly steamed down the plate. In fact, there was only a skeleton crew on board, and then she anchored just off the main seaway, and we were all closed up round our action stations, and a voice came on the tannoy system, which was a loudspeaker system throughout the ship. "This is the captain speaking. Our aircraft has just reported that Graf Spee has blown herself up."
With the world's press watching, the Graf Spee's crew had opened her seacocks and set off demolition charges. Captain Langsdorff and his crew left the scene by boat and then sought sanctuary in nearby Buenos Aires. There, under the old Imperial Navy ensign, and not the swastika, Langsdorff shot himself. On their return to Britain, the veterans of the River Plate were given a hero's welcome.
We had a march past through London after being inspected by King George VI. And then we had luncheon with Winston in the Guildhall.
Winston Churchill, a figure as popular with the service as he is with the rest of the nation.
The brilliant sea fight, which Admiral Harwood conceived, and which you executed, takes its place in our naval annals, and I may add that in a dark, cold winter, it warmed the cockles of the British heart.
The destruction of the Admiral Graf Spee restored Britain's faith in its navy. But over the coming months, further good news was hard to come by. On May the 10th, 1940, Germany's armies rolled into Holland and Belgium and extended the frontiers of the Third Reich. That same day, political upheaval forced Prime Minister Chamberlain from power. Britain's future now rested with Winston Churchill. But within weeks of coming to office, German land forces all but overwhelmed France, forcing the evacuation of more than 300,000 Allied troops at Dunkirk. Hitler was soon standing on a French beach, casting his eye across the English Channel and contemplating an invasion of Britain. Italy added to Churchill's concerns. Under the fascist dictator Benito Mussolini, Italy had joined Germany in the war. With the fall of France and the loss of its naval support, Britain was now outnumbered in the Mediterranean by a modern Italian battle fleet. From his office underground in the cabinet war rooms, Churchill faced a stark reality. Britain stood alone, and the navy, which he relied upon, was stretched to its limits. In late June 1940, Churchill received an intelligence report concerning 4 French battleships that had taken refuge in the Algerian harbour of Oran. Under the terms of the armistice, which France had signed with Germany and Italy, her warships were now pledged to neutrality. Fearing they would be seized and used against Britain, Churchill ordered a naval mission unparalleled since the Battle of Trafalgar. A mission to confront the French fleet. The following day, a British naval force set sail for the French colony of Algeria.
Our captain then was Captain Glennie, and he used to sing out over the loudspeakers right their way through the ship. Good morning, Hoods. We are now proceeding to Oran to persuade the French fleet to come out under our protection.
On arrival at Oran, the British dispatched a message to the French commander. Either join Britain in the fight against Germany and Italy, immobilize your ships, or be destroyed. The French rejected the ultimatum.
Vice-Admiral Somerville, you could see him standing there, very serious. He didn't want to do it. Nobody wanted to do it. He said, all right, open fire.
In a matter of minutes, 3 French battleships were destroyed. Only a single battleship, the Strasbourg, broke through the British cordon, accompanied by 3 destroyers.
I fully agreed with the action that we took, because if all those ships had gone over to the Germans or the Italians, there'd been more ships to attack us at sea, and we'd have lost more lives. In fact, I was very pleased that we did sink them.
More than 1,100 once Allied French sailors perished. The Royal Navy considered the mission a success. But a failure of diplomacy robbed Britain of 4 additional battleships with which to fight the Italian Navy. In mid-1940, Italy's fast and powerful battle fleet tried to push the Royal Navy from the Mediterranean. But early battles between the 2 forces favoured the British. In one encounter, the Italian flagship Giulio Cesare was hit by a 15-inch shell from the battleship Warspite. The distance of nearly 10 miles was the greatest range ever achieved against a moving target. But in November 1940, the newly built British aircraft carrier Illustrious brought a new dimension to distance in the war at sea. Carriers were a late arrival at the end of the First World War and remained largely untested in battle. Their chance came late in the evening of November the 1st, when two waves of Swordfish aircraft took off from Illustrious. Their target? Italy's Mediterranean battle fleet, lying at anchor in the port of Taranto, 170 miles away. Aerial photographs taken the next day revealed torpedoes and bombs had destroyed 3 Italian battleships. The balance of naval power in the Mediterranean was now in Britain's favour. The Battle of Taranto electrified naval strategists around the globe. A carrier had destroyed battleships from well beyond the range of their big guns. War at sea had entered a new era. Adolf Hitler freely admitted that on land he was a hero and at sea a coward. He advised his naval high command to use its capital ships to hunt only merchant vessels and to avoid action with the Royal Navy. Hitler's greatest concern was the safety of Germany's newest battleship, Bismarck. In May 1941, she completed her sea trials and training. Displacing more than 51,000 tons and mounting 8 15-inch guns, Bismarck was the world's most powerful battleship in service.
Bismarck was, in my view, the finest battleship in the world. She was also one of the most graceful, massive, but at the same time beautiful, and an enormous feeling of power about her.
On the 18th of May, 1941, Bismarck set sail on her first mission, accompanied by the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen. Bismarck's orders to cruise the North Atlantic and sink merchant ships steaming between America and Britain. It was to be the most dramatic maiden voyage since that of the ill-fated ocean liner Titanic. Three days into the voyage, British aerial reconnaissance discovered the 2 German ships refueling in a Norwegian fjord. The British Admiralty immediately deployed several powerful hunting groups to pursue Bismarck, including the new battleship Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser Hood.
The Hood was the epitome of British sea power. She was a wonderfully looking ship. And some people said, though, she was unsinkable. Well, no ship is unsinkable. It's impossible. It's a contradiction in terms.
The following morning, between Iceland and Greenland, Hood and the Prince of Wales intercepted Bismarck.
We'd fired about half a dozen salvos, I suppose, before Bismarck replied.
For a battleship that had never before fired her guns in anger, Bismarck proved devastatingly accurate.
I heard no explosion at all. All I saw was a gigantic sheet of flame which seemed to shoot round the side. From the very beginning, there were only 3 of us came to the surface. There wasn't another soul in sight. And I looked around, and there she was, like that, vertical, about 50 yards away. And B turret was just going under. I panicked and I turned and swam as fast as I could away from her. When I looked around again, she'd gone.
More than 1,400 men went down with their ship. There were only 3 survivors.
The shock was so great when the first news of her sinking came through that a lot of people didn't believe it. They said, this is not so, this is impossible, this is the pride of the British Navy, the pride of the empire. She can't have gone like that. So it was more than just the loss of one ship. It was the loss, if you like, of the empire.
The loss of Hood stunned Churchill. He dispatched every available warship, regardless of the cost or the consequences, to sink the Bismarck. Four British battleships and 2 carriers sped to the area. To Churchill, Britain's control of the seas was at stake. If Bismarck escaped, he said, it would be trumpeted around the world to the nation's great detriment and discomfort.
We all felt that same way. We were all Churchills in our own mind. Then we had to destroy Bismarck. Bismarck could never go on existing. We were all saying, sink her, kill him, you know, gosh, yes. We wanted revenge.
Swordfish aircraft flew from the carrier Victorious and discovered Bismarck sailing due south. The torpedo attack caused only minor damage. But Bismarck sailed for the French port of Brest, leaking oil from her earlier encounter with Hood and Prince of Wales. Soon after, Bismarck shook off 2 shadowing British cruisers and disappeared from their radar screens. "30 hours later, a British Catalina flying boat spotted Bismarck's oil slick. The carrier Ark Royal flew off a torpedo strike.
A lucky torpedo hit the rudder of the Bismarck and jammed it at 15 degrees to port. And this meant that the Bismarck was unmaneuverable. And they tried every way they could to steer for Brest, but every time they did, the bows swung round into the wind, and the wind was where we were coming from.
And we had a speech by our captain, and he said, "There's no escape." Because he knew you cannot steer a ship. And if you cannot steer a ship, you can't escape. And in the morning of the 27th of May, we met the British forces. At 9 o'clock, we had so many hits that the first officer told us, everybody ever on ship. and it was rainy and stormy. But anyway, one tries to live. I saw the ship destroyed. Everything was destroyed.
Of Bismarck's crew of 2,200 men, there were only 110 survivors. The destruction of Germany's largest battleship shocked Hitler and was a major setback to his war against British trade. It also marked a turning point in the history of the battleship itself. Instead of the hunter, they had become the hunted, and prime targets for both the underwater and aerial arms of opposing navies. For the crews and officers of the great battleships, war at sea was becoming a three-dimensional nightmare, and a far more dangerous game than anyone could have conceived. Throughout 1941, the war edged precariously towards a global conflict. Earlier that year, Japan had signed an access agreement with Germany and Italy. Japan was determined to become the dominant power in Asia, but standing in her way was the United States. When tough negotiations between the two powers foundered, the Japanese government embarked on a dramatic plan to force America into submission. In the mid-Pacific, 6 Japanese aircraft carriers sailed eastward toward Hawaii, home of the powerful US Pacific Fleet. On the 7th of December 1941, at 10 to 8 in the morning, a faint drone of approaching aircraft was heard over the United States naval base at Pearl Harbor.
The timing was ideal on a Sunday morning when the fleet was essentially sleeping, both literally and figuratively. And there was a mindset that it couldn't happen.
Without warning or a declaration of war, 2 waves of Japanese planes, more than 350 in total, crossed the island of Oahu unchallenged.
When the airplanes was coming towards you, you can't tell whether they're Japanese or Americans, and they look like ours from a distance. And we wonder, what in the heck are they doing training using live torpedoes? And then all of a sudden, our first sergeant came up that blew him out of his office. He was soaking wet and covered with oil. He come up and says, "Get your butts to your battle station." He says, "We're under attack by the Japanese." Now, the Arizona was right in back of us, and we were up on the bridge when she exploded. The concussion from the explosion blew us into the pilot house, and then we went back out up on the bridge and looked at the Arizona, and she was just one tremendous ball of fire. And I'll admit it, I was scared. I thought this is the end of everything.
In less than 2 hours, 21 vessels of the Pacific Fleet, including 8 battleships, were destroyed or badly damaged. The only compensation for America was that 3 of her aircraft carriers were at sea on a training exercise and had survived to fight another day.
After the attack was over with, about 10 o'clock, things got quiet. And except for the burning and the crackling of the ships, that's when it hit me. My God, we're in a war. We're in a war, and we lost it. And I just sat down and cried.
More than 2,400 men were killed and over 1,000 wounded in the attack. Japan's objective to immobilize the US Pacific Fleet had succeeded.
Pearl Harbor is one of the most brilliant military operations ever taken in the history of warfare. Strategically, it was a disaster, absolute disaster. The possibility of a negotiated settlement went out the window when they attacked Pearl Harbor. It was then war to the death.
For Britain, Pearl Harbor brought a powerful new ally and a new, determined enemy. One she was ill-equipped to fight. Weeks earlier, Churchill had ordered a small squadron of warships to sail to the British base at Singapore. The battlecruiser Repulse and the battleship Prince of Wales spearheaded Force Z.
Included in the force, the British force, was a full fleet carrier. But at quite an early stage in the passage out, the carrier, which was out in the West Indies, ran aground on a sandbank, and so no other carrier was forthcoming.
The ships had arrived at Singapore just 5 days before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor.
Churchill rather underestimated Japanese robustness. He had said in the late 20s when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer and trying to stop the Royal Navy building cruisers, there will never be a war with Japan in my lifetime. And I think that Churchill really thought that these 2 ships sent out there would act as a very potent deterrent. That wasn't the case.
The day after Pearl Harbor, Japan invaded the British colony of Malaya. Nearby Singapore was in danger. Churchill immediately convened a crisis meeting to review naval positions. He knew if Singapore fell, Japan would be masters of the Pacific. Australia, New Zealand, and all the vital islands in their region would then be open to invasion. On their own and without air cover, Britain's 2 capital ships were in a dangerous position.
I had dinner alone with my father in Prince of Wales. I suppose it would have been 2 nights before she finally sailed. And we hadn't seen each other for the inside of a year, so we had lots to talk about. And he didn't like the situation. He asked me what I thought about it. In my youthful ignorance, I remember saying, oh, let them come, let's have a go at them. And he's turning a very serious face to me and saying, I don't think you have any idea of the enormity of the odds we're up against.
Late afternoon on the 8th of December 1941, Force Z set sail to intercept a Japanese invasion fleet off Thailand. The next evening, a message reached the war room. The ships were returning to Singapore after being shadowed by enemy aircraft. Churchill suggested they sail to safer waters and later join what was left of the American fleet. But the hour was late, and the decision was deferred until the next morning. As Britain slept, Japanese land-based bombers hunted for the British ships. The only comfort for Britain was the fact that no capital ship maneuvering at sea had ever been sunk by aircraft. But early the next day, Churchill received word that the Prince of Wales and Repulse had been sunk with the loss of 840 men.
It's not for me to speak with the voice of Winston Churchill. I can only suppose he was thinking in terms of deterrence, that by sending these two mighty ships out there, that would be such a powerful signal to the Japanese that they would not invade. Whether you regard that as a valid thought, a rational thought, or whether you regard it as supreme British arrogance is a matter of taste. Possibly distorted by personal reasons, I take the latter view.
Britain had been humbled in the Pacific, but in waters closer to home, she was being dogged by surface attacks on her convoys. Churchill described the destruction of war supplies bound for Russia as one of the most melancholy aspects of the war. Indeed, Germany's 3 remaining battleships had become an obsession for Churchill, tying up scores of British warships to contain them. But one by one, they were brought to heel.
The whole of the action was fought in the dark. Brilliant work by the destroyer screens slowed up the Scharnhorst, which enabled the great guns of the Duke of York to score repeated hits.
In late 1944, Air Force bombers carrying massive 12,000-pound bombs were dispatched to a Norwegian fjord. Their mission? To sink the last remaining German battleship, the Tirpitz, sister ship of Bismarck. The destruction of Germany's last capital ship was a boost for British morale. For the second time in 25 years, the core of the German battle fleet had ceased to exist.
During the First World War, the German battle fleet achieved nothing. During World War II, if we look at the German Navy and its performance in this respect, it also achieved more or less nothing. What we also should not forget in this respect is the fact that the age of battleships was definitely over.
In the first months of the Pacific War, both America and Japan realized their main strategic naval weapon was no longer the battleship, but the aircraft carrier. In the battles of the Coral Sea and Midway, carrier-borne aircraft proved they could deliver everything a battleship could, but over a range of hundreds rather than tens of miles. For the first time in naval history, ships exchanged blows without being in sight of each other.
From 1942 onward, I think, it had become clear that there was a new capital ship at sea, and that was the aircraft carrier. An aircraft carrier with a large complement of strike aircraft was now capable of sinking even the heaviest units of the other side.
At Midway, the Japanese force lost 4 carriers to America's 1. The balance of sea power in the Pacific now rested with the United States. To maintain her advantage, America mobilized her superior industrial capacity to build a massive carrier fleet. But this came at the expense of battleship development. 10 battleships laid down before Pearl Harbor would be completed during the war. But 7 others, including 5 60,000-ton giants, were cancelled. Four 45,000-ton Iowa-class super battleships did enter service. Armed with 9 16-inch guns, they were amongst the most formidable battleships ever created, but they were destined for a secondary role, escorting and protecting the carrier fleet.
They provided insurance against the Japanese surface attacks. They provided anti-aircraft firepower on a very large scale. But they didn't have that interesting a war.
Ironically, just when the battleship had reached its peak in armor, speed and firepower, both American and British naval strategists were beginning seriously to doubt their relevance in modern war.
It began to be realized that the battleship was no longer the supreme queen of the oceans. There was a meeting at the end of 1942, chaired by Deputy First Sea Lord, which came to the conclusion that in future, the aircraft carrier would be the core of the future fleet. Sir Stanley Goodall, who was at the meeting, the Director of Naval Construction, notes in his diary, "Hurrah, at last." And since he'd made his reputation as a battleship designer, that was particularly impressive.
The battleship's days were numbered. But for Japan, they were now her last hope against the advancing Allied forces. In the first 3 years of the Pacific War, Japan had lost all but 4 of her carriers, while America's carrier fleet had grown to more than 30. Japan's fate now rested with 9 battleships, including the 71,000-ton giants Musashi and Yamato. In size and firepower, these were the most formidable battleships ever created.
The Japanese Navy simply refused to use these warships for anything other than the final showdown. These 2 ships sort of wandered around the Pacific, being stationed at various places as the nucleus of what the combined fleet hoped would be the strike force that would meet the Americans in this mythical holy grail of the decisive battle at sea.
With only the Philippines standing in the way of an American attack on Japan, her super battleships were finally forced into the cauldron. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, in terms of numbers of ships, was the largest naval encounter in history. It was also the last ever confrontation when battleship faced battleship. But in the end, it was America's overwhelming carrier numbers and their combined strike power which proved the decisive factor.
As we approached, our skipper told us to make an anvil attack and take the easternmost Yamato-type class ship, which turned out to be the Musashi.
10月24日の渋谷海戦で私は艦橋から武蔵が集中攻撃を受けたのを見ていたのですが、魚雷が当たった14本まで数えておりまして。
Musashi was one of 3 Japanese battleships and 4 carriers lost in the battle. It was all but the end for the Japanese Imperial Navy. As the Allies made their final thrust towards the Japanese mainland, the last super battleship of the Imperial fleet, Yamato, attempted to reclaim her nation's honor. With only enough fuel for a one-way voyage, Yamato embarked on a suicide mission to attack Allied naval forces off Okinawa. For 2 hours, 380 American planes from 10 carriers pounded the world's largest battleship until she capsized. "2,200 men perished, along with the dream of a Japanese empire." Four months later, in August 1945, the Pacific War reached its climax. After 6 long years of global conflict, the guns of the great floating fortresses had fallen silent. "35 of the world's most famous battleships were destroyed or scuttled. More than half had fallen victim to air attack. But while the aircraft carrier had dominated the Pacific War, the battleship somehow maintained its prestige to the end.
I now invite the representatives of the Emperor.
In Tokyo Bay, beneath the imposing 16-inch guns of the battleship Missouri, the Japanese Imperial forces offered their unconditional surrender.
Sign the instrument of surrender at the places indicated.
The Missouri symbolized the power and might of the United States. Here was a sovereign piece of the United States come to the very doorstep of the conquered nation. There could be no doubt which nation was the victor and which was the vanquished.
Post-war, battleships gradually disappeared from battle fleets. Indeed, no new battleships left the drawing board. Only America's most modern battleships, the Iowas, would again see action. In Korea and Vietnam, they pounded the shoreline of communism as the Cold War escalated. The Gulf War in 1991 was the swan song of the last 2 American battleships, Missouri and Wisconsin. Even armed with missiles, which extended their range to hundreds of miles, they were little more than expensive launching platforms. By the turn of the 21st century, no battleships remained in commission.
History will look at the battleship and say, here was the most fiendish weapon that man could devise at the time.
Battleships were, in the end, I think, worthwhile investment. I think nations did get something out of it, and what they got out of it was sometimes quite crucial. National survival could depend on command of the sea.
One is tempted to say they also represent the folly of man to construct such enormous, eventually useless naval weapons. But they seemed at the time that they were conceived to make sense.
After more than 3 centuries ruling the oceans, the controversial reign of the battleship was over. The knights of the first global arms race had gone the way of the rulers and the empires that had created them.